"They have fallen," said Snape. "Follow me." Harry and Ron, not daring to look at each other, followed Snape up the stairs and into the large, deserted entrance hall of the castle, lit by blazing torches. The delicious, appetizing smell of food wafted from the great hall, but Snape led them from the warm, lighted space of the entrance hall to the narrow stone steps that led to the dungeons. Snape stood in the cold corridor, opened the door, and said, "Come in quickly." They entered Snape's office, trembling with fear. The shadowy walls of the room were lined with shelves. In the large, wide-mouthed jars that lined the shelves floated disgusting, nauseating substances that Harry had no desire to know the names of at that moment. The wall heater was off and empty. Snape closed the door and he turned back. He looked at them and said to the male, "That train travel isn't very interesting for the famous Harry Potter and his friend and father, Weasley. You wanted your entrance to school to sound like a cannon, right, guys?" "No sir, the railing of King's Cross Station," Snape said coldly. "What did you do to the car?" Ron swallowed. It wasn't the first time Harry had felt that Snape could read people's minds, but a few moments later, when Snape opened the rolled-up copy of that day's Evening Post, Harry realized his mistake. Snape showed them the headline and said quietly, "Did not see you on the front page of the newspaper." In large letters, it read, "Ford Anglia, the Flying Muggles confused." Snape began to read the newspaper aloud. "Two Muggles in London confessed to seeing an old car flying over the post office tower. Mrs. Hattie Bayliss in Norfolk while hanging out clothes at noon. Mr. Angus Fleet of Peebles reported to the police. Your father has 6 or 7 Muggles working in the Muggle misuse department, hasn't he?" Snape raised his head and stared at Ron with a sly smile. Wow, now his own son. Harry felt as if one of the big branches of that crazy tree had hit him in the stomach. What if someone knew that Mr. Weasley had enchanted the car? He hadn't noticed at all. Snape continued. "According to my inspection of the castle grounds, a willow tree with a value of damage considerably seen." Suddenly, this sentence came out of Ron's mouth. "That tree hurt us more," Snape said angrily. "Silent. It's a pity that you're not in my group, so I can't kick you out. Now I'll go and get those who have this delightful power, so wait here." Harry and Ron looked at each other with pale faces. Harry was no longer hungry. He was no longer nauseated. He tried not to look at the glass on the shelf behind Snape's desk, where a large slimy thing was floating in a green liquid. If Snape had gone after Professor McGonagall, the head of Gryffindor, they wouldn't have been much better off. She was fairer than Snape, but extremely serious and strict. 10 minutes later Snape returned, bringing Professor McGonagall with him. Harry had seen her look angry many times before, but either he had forgotten how tightly her lips pressed together when she was angry, or he had never seen her so angry. As soon as he entered the room he raised his wand. Harry and Ron flinched, but he had pointed it at the unlit stove, which immediately burst into flames. "Sit down," he said. They both stepped back and sat down by the fire. "Explain," said Professor McGonagall, her glasses gleaming unpleasantly. Ron told the whole story, from the moment the station gate refused to let them in until the end, and finally said, "Professor, that's why we had no other choice because we couldn't. Let's get on the train." Professor McGonagall turned to Harry in a cold tone and said, "Why didn't you send us a letter by L? You have an L." "It didn't occur to me." "Yes, it's quite obvious that you haven't thought about it." At that moment, there was a knock on the door and Snape, looking happier than ever, entered the room. This time, Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, was standing next to him. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore's face was not as it always was, and it was he looked unhappy, glaring at them from the top of his humpbacked nose, and Harry would have preferred to be with Ron by the Whomping Willow, the whip whipping their heads and faces like its branches, instead of being there. Dumbledore said after a long silence, "Please explain why you did this." He wished he had shouted at them. Harry couldn't bear to hear Dumbledore's despairing voice. He couldn't meet Dumbledore's eyes, and he looked down at his knees as he spoke. He told Dumbledore everything except that the magical car belonged to Mr. Weasley. He pretended that he and Ron had found the flying car in front of the station. He knew that Dumbledore would guess this immediately, but Dumbledore didn't ask any questions about the car. When Harry had finished, Dumbledore was still staring at the two of them. "Stayed," said Ron, disappointed. "We're going to pack our things." Professor McGonagall said angrily. "What do you mean, Weasley? You're firing us." Harry looked at Dumbledore immediately, and Dumbledore said, "We're not expelling you today, Mr. Weasley, but I want you both to know what a dangerous thing you've done. I'll be sending letters to both of your families tonight. I'm warning you that if you do this again, you'll have to. I want to fire you." Suddenly, the world seemed to have come crashing down on Snape. He cleared his throat. Did and said, "Professor Dumbledore, these children have broken the law prohibiting underage wizards from practicing magic, damaging an old tree worth millions of dollars. It's not that bad. Of course, these kinds of things." Dumbledore said calmly. "Severus, it is up to Professor McGonagall to decide how to punish these children. These children are in her group and they are responsible for them." Professor Dumbledore turned to Professor McGonagall and said, "Minerva, I need to go back to the Great Hall and give the children a few pointers. Come on, Severus, there's a jar of juicy, colorful fruit jelly I want you to sample." Snape glared at Harry and Ron with hatred and left them alone in his office with Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall, still glaring at them like an angry eagle, said to Ron, "Weasley, you'd better go to the infirmary first, you're injured." Ron quickly wiped the wound above his eyebrow with his sleeve and said, "It's nothing, Professor, I wanted to see my sister during the sorting. The sorting ceremony is over. My sister is in Gryffindor." "How good. Now that we're talking about Gryffindor." Harry immediately interrupted him and said, "Professor, the term hadn't started yet when we arrived in that car, so Gryffindor shouldn't be deducted points, right?" Harry looked at Professor McGonagall with concern. The professor glared at Harry, but Harry was sure she was smiling. She pursed her lips. He didn't press it either. He said, "I'm not taking points away from Gryffindor, but..." Harry felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. "Professor McGonagall, but both of you should be punished." It was much better than Harry had anticipated. Dumbledore's letter to the Sullies didn't matter at all. Harry was sure they would be upset that the Batter-Willow hadn't torn him to pieces. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed to Snape's table. A large plate of sandwiches appeared on the table with a bumblebee sound, along with 2 goblets and a pitcher of iced pumpkin juice. Professor McGonagall said, "Eat your food here and then go straight to your dorm." "I should too. Let's go back to the Great Hall." When the door closed behind him, Ron gave a long whistle and picked up a sandwich. And said, "I thought we were done." Harry also took the sandwich and said, "Me too." Ron said with a mouth full of food. "See what a crazy luck we had? Fred and George have ridden 5 or 6 times so far. Those cars have become birds, but no one has ever seen them." Ron swallowed his mouthful and took another bite of his sandwich, saying, "Why couldn't we get over the fence?" Harry shrugged and took a big sip of his pumpkin juice. He ate and said, "We need to focus from now on, we can't afford to make mistakes anymore. I wish we could attend the celebration." Ron said smartly. The professor didn't want us to be in the sunny crowd. He didn't want the kids to think. Ken, coming to school in a flying car is a good thing. After they had eaten as many sandwiches as they wanted, plate after plate was filled with sandwiches, they left Snape's office and took their usual familiar route to Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet and deserted. Apparently, the celebration had ended. They passed the chattering paintings and the creaking armor and helmets, climbed the narrow stone stairs, and finally reached the corridor that contained the secret door to Gryffindor Tower. The secret door to the tower was behind a painting that showed a very fat woman in a pink silk dress. As they approached the painting, the fat woman said to them, "Password?" Harry hummed. They didn't know the New Year's password because they hadn't seen any of the Gryffindor seniors yet. But help arrived quickly. The two heard hurried footsteps behind them, and when they turned around they saw Hermione Granger coming towards them at a fast pace. She said, "I finally found you. Where have you been? I've heard some ridiculous rumors. Someone said you two were fired because you hit a bird with your car." Harry reassured him and said, "We were not fired." "Don't you mean you really flew this far?" Hermione's tone was as serious and reproachful as Professor McGonagall's. Ron said impatiently, "For God's sake, don't lecture us anymore. Just give us a new code name. Say." Hermione also said restlessly, "The code name is Honey-Eating Chicken, but know this." But Hermione was cut off because as soon as the fat lady's painting moved away, suddenly there was a loud cheer and cheering. It seemed that every student in Gryffindor Tower was awake. They were all gathered in the circular common room of the tower. They were standing on tilted tables and easy chairs, waiting for them to enter. Many hands reached out to pull Harry and Ron out of the hole in the painting, but Hermione had to struggle her way out of the hole herself. Lee Jordan shouted, "What an amazing entrance! You landed right on the Beaters Willow with a flying car. Everyone will be talking about this by the end of the year." A fifth-year student whom Harry had never spoken to said, "Well done to you." Someone is tapping them on the shoulder from behind, as if they are running a marathon. Had one. Fred and George pushed their way through the crowd and came forward, saying together, "Then why didn't you call us?" "Huh?" Ron, his face as red as a lipstick, smiled sheepishly, but Harry's eyes fell on someone who didn't look happy at all. Over the heads of several excited first years, he saw Percy trying to push his way through the crowd and scold them. Harry nudged Ron in the side with his elbow and nodded in Percy's direction. Ron understood immediately and said, "We have to go upstairs, we're so tired." They both pushed through the crowd and hurried towards a door at the other end of the hall that led to the spiral staircase and the dormitories. Harry turned and said to Hermione, who was frowning like Percy, "Good night." Finally, they reached the other side of the common room, and while the students were still patting them on the back with an admiring expression, they reached the quiet spiral staircase. They hurried up the stairs until they finally reached the door at the bottom. They arrived at their old dormitory, which now had a sign that read, "Second years entered their familiar circular room," which contained 5 double beds with red velvet curtains. The windows were tall and narrow. Their suitcases had been moved to their dormitory and placed at the end of their beds. Ron smiled guiltily at Harry and said, "I know I shouldn't have enjoyed this, but..." At that moment, the dormitory door opened and the other second-year boys from Gryffindor Tower, Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom, entered the room. Seamus smiled and said, "It was unbelievable." Dean said, "I liked it." Neville said with a stunned look, "It was amazing." Harry couldn't help but laugh his head off.